Well, good afternoon once again, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Today's webinar from the American Society of Adaptation Professionals is on the fundamentals of the field, and this is a review of an emerging document that we've been working on to help bring some more formation and standardization across the field of adaptation. We hope that leading up to this webinar, you've had an opportunity to look at the ASAP fundamentals of the field, but if you haven't, that's okay, and I do recommend pulling it up now and beginning to take a look at it. You can find a link to that document in the chat box, and that link will take you into a Google Doc, which should be accessible to you, and you can look through this document as we go ahead and get started. During the webinar today, we'll be talking a bit about the purpose, evolution, and origins of the document. We'll receive a tour of it, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. Following the webinar, you'll be directed to a form where you can submit written feedback on the fundamentals for the field and also indicate interest in continuing to stay engaged in the development and review process. Just some housekeeping before we get started. Please do remember to keep your microphones on mute. If you have a question or technical problem during the course of the presentation, please use the chat box. You can type any questions or concerns you have in there, and you can make sure you'll be receiving some feedback from one of our staff who's on the call who can help you through any of those challenges you might experience. If you have a question during the Q&A portion or before we arrive at the Q&A portion, please go ahead and use the question function. You should see the option for questions in the toolbox along the right-hand side of your screen. I do encourage you to use that space to ask any questions that come up over the course of the webinar, even before we get to the Q&A session. Often we put off asking those questions and we forget about them. So go ahead and use the question box as questions arise, and we'll make sure to moderate those all through the end. If you have a question that you feel like would be better asked in person, you can use the raise your hand function. You should see along the left-hand side of your toolbox a little hand that you can put up. Go ahead and click on that. We'll see that you have a question and we can unmute your line. If you do raise your hand to ask a question, make sure to go ahead and unmute yourself on your side so that when we come to you, we can have an easy pickup so that we're able to chat with you about what your question may be. You should see also in your toolbox function that we have a handouts area. That handout, if you are unable to view the Google document, then we just put into the handouts a review copy of the ASAP fundamentals for the field. So you can go ahead and pick up that document there, and you'll be able to follow along with us as we go through this review. It's just a little bit of background. I want to talk for a minute about the American Society of Adaptation Professionals and how we came to working on this document. ASAP is the premier professional society for adaptation professionals in the United States. As such, we're dedicated to supporting and connecting adaptation professionals while advancing excellence and innovation in the field of adaptation. We see this work being performed through 4 program areas, and those are our member network and support. And here you can find the types of resources that include our online website, which you can go to and you can access resources which are tailored to your interest area or region. We have our affinity groups, over 8 different groups, which convene and discuss subjects including communication approaches, projects and evaluation mechanisms, policy, the development of this fundamentals for the field, and code of ethics. We have our program area of field advancement and standardization, and here is where we really think about our role in trying to look at the field of adaptation as 1,000 flowers blooming and the way in which we can help to cultivate that garden, and saying that we use our Regional Adaptation Leadership Award, our Prize for Progress program, and of course, the fundamentals of the field as mechanisms for identifying promising and best practices, and then promoting those best practices and ensuring that the fundamentals of how this work gets done become consistent across other sectors which are engaging in adaptation, and of course that there's a leadership through the adaptation field for forming really the field itself and the best practices of the field. Our policy and education component involves our policy committee, wherein we really take advantage of the fact that ASAP members work at the local, state, and federal level, and we use this as a way of helping to articulate what are the needs on the local in the local communities up to state and federal resources, and then we help our partners and members who work at the federal level to understand how are their resources and how are their programs being applied to the local level, and how can we as a civil society organization help to enhance those public resources. And of course that's ever more important as we have these shifting sands of public resources out there. And then fourth, in the ASAP programs, our voice for the field. And here's where ASAP strives to tell the story of adaptation and adaptation excellence from across the country. And we try to do this in a way that tells that story of adaptation work both after a crisis, but more importantly, before the crisis. We know that people are thinking about resilience and thinking about how to make their social, physical, and natural systems more resilient. And we want to make sure that those stories are told so that the rest of our communities can understand both what is adaptation and who to look to for leadership and engagement. For the rest of this webinar, you'll be hearing a bit from me. I'm Beth Gibbons. I'm the ASAP Managing Director, and you'll also be hearing from Rachel Jacobson, who's been leading this effort in developing both the fundamentals of the field and helping to develop this process for engaging you in reviewing this document and helping us think about how we can be applying it. So to that, let us dive in, and I'll tell you more about where this document has evolved from and what do we see for its purpose in the long run. So the purpose of the ASAP Fundamentals of the Field is that it is a living document that reflects existing and aspirational principles of practice for climate adaptation practitioners. The Fundamentals of the Field is intended to serve as a standalone resource that all adaptation professionals can reference to guide their work, but it also is intended as a foundational resource for the development of ASAP training programs in the future. And in these programs, we're thinking of our training programs of advancing the field, transforming the field, and then delivering resources for climate impacted professionals. When we think about the evolution of this document, much of it was embodied in that summary of ASAP that I just delivered. As ASAP continues to support and connect members and also work to form the adaptation field, we've heard that it's critically important that we begin to set some standards of practice throughout the field. And so ASAP undertook, along with its members and along with other members across the climate community, a review of the best practices that are embodied both in gray literature, white literature, and then through a series of focus group calls to hear from people like yourselves. What are the principles of practice in this burgeoning field? And here we've put together those findings. The goal then is, of course, to have this codified, to have it be approved, and then to build trainings that can help to advance and transform our field going forward. As I said, the contents of this draws on both qualitative and quantitative resources. There are no citations included in the fundamentals of the field because the concepts which are articulated here are really a synthesis of many field-spanning documents. However, if you're somebody who would like to dive deeper in to the resource list and see where these resources evolve from, we can certainly share that information with you because we have it available. At this point, I am going to hand the presentation over to Rachel. She's going to take us on a tour of the document and be able to introduce us to the different sections, and then we'll have an opportunity to talk more deeply about potential application and hear from all of you as you react to this resource. Rachel, I'll give it to you.
Thanks so much, Beth. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Jacobson. I'm a consultant working with ASAP on fundamentals for the field, and As Beth mentioned, I'm going to take you on a short tour of the document. Hopefully you did have a chance to peruse it yourself before the webinar, but if you didn't, that's totally fine, and you can open it up now and follow along as we're going through. So as Beth alluded to, the fundamentals for the field were developed to be purposefully broad so that they could be applied to any potential context where adaptation action is occurring, or where adaptation action could or should occur in the future. But because they're so broad, each category is really quite rich with content and may include multiple ideas that are fundamental to adaptation practice. So if you're someone who is interested in really sort of scrutinizing what the categories are and what falls underneath them, which is certainly something that we welcome, do be sure to read the document in depth, and we would welcome your feedback on that. And also, as Beth described a little bit, the fundamentals for the field are meant to both talk about the way that adaptation is currently practiced, as well as articulate a vision for how adaptation could or should be practiced in the future that will make the practice of adaptation as equitable, ethical, and effective as possible. So, as you likely noticed, either from looking at this slide or in your own review, the fundamentals for the field contains 5 primary sections: an introduction, a where to start section, where to go, how to get there, and what to do. And I'll briefly describe what's in each section and why it was included. Just one caveat, and I will talk about this a little bit more as we go through. Remember that this document is meant to apply specifically to the practice of adaptation by professionals, rather than describe the way that adaptation happens on the ground in a community. So so just remember, as we're going through, to look at this from the perspective of the practitioner themselves, which is you. So our first section, introduction section, I think we'll go to the next slide for this. So the introduction lays out 2 principles that we believe are core or foundational to everything that happens in the adaptation space. And those 2 principles are leadership and vision, and then power and decision making. So we've seen time and again that visionary leadership is a critical precursor to all aspects of adaptation. And in the fundamentals for the field, we've noted that leadership and vision can come from many places, not just the top. And we really see that, again, as an overarching core foundational principle, and so that's why we've put it in the introduction. And then power and decision making. So ASAP, through the fundamentals for the field and other mechanisms as well, is really working with our members to build a more just, equitable, and effective field of practice. And research has shown, and we believe, that inclusive decision making and building power for oppressed and underrepresented populations and people must be a central component of our work. And so we've put this principle of power and decision making right at the front as well. So the next section is where to go, and this section articulates the core outcomes that ASAP believes should be the focus of adaptation practitioners' work. And in keeping with this sort of spirit of vision and leadership that I just described in the introduction section, so we chose to include outcomes towards the beginning of the document because we think, especially from the practitioner perspective, that there's a lot of value in knowing where you're headed before figuring out the best way to get there. So we put outcomes right here front and center in order to encourage practitioners to stay focused on end goals. Again, remember, this is a description of what we hope the practice of adaptation by trained professionals will lead to. And so these outcomes are related, but not identical to adaptation-focused outcomes that a particular locality or organization or sector may develop for themselves. But the outcomes listed here are broad, as we recognize that ASAP practitioners and climate adaptation practitioners are working in many different contexts. So the where to start section articulates values and beliefs that underpin our work as adaptation practitioners. And if you're familiar with the ASAP Code of Ethics, you'll notice that we reference many of the ideas that are in the Code of Ethics here in this Where to Start section. These two documents, the Fundamentals for the Field and the ASAP Code of Ethics, have been developed to reinforce one another. So we hope and expect that all of the values and beliefs listed here and as they're described more in depth in the document will really feel intuitive to all adaptation professionals, and that perhaps any values and beliefs that might feel a little bit newer to people will over time become core tenets in our field of practice. And then just generally, ASAP believes that it is important to build a system of shared values among our members and among other climate practitioners, and to transparently articulate what those values are. So the next section is how to get there, and this describes tried and true strategies for doing effective, ethical, and equitable adaptation work. So we expect that all adaptation professionals will recognize each of these strategies in their own work. And as you may expect, we believe that truly effective, ethical, and equitable adaptation work requires use of many of these strategies at once, but there are also many different ways to apply each of these strategies. I'll just note that oh, okay. So I'll note that this use existing best practices strategy is a little bit vague, but what it includes, and you'll see this inside the document, is that we are trying to say that it's important to use best practices both for program design and management and best practices for communication and engagement. And we chose to structure it this way because while many adaptation professionals have a lot of lessons learned regarding these two strategies, program design and management, and communications and engagement, they're not unique to adaptation work, and so we wanted to include them, but we wanted to make sure to articulate that those are important best practices that other fields of practice may be using as well, and they're not necessarily fundamental just to adaptation. And again, these strategies are the strategies that we expect adaptation practitioners will use in their work, and they may align with the strategies adopted by a particular organization or sector or location as they're trying to implement adaptation actions, but that those two lists of strategies won't be identical. This and the one that you see here is targeted to practitioners. Okay, so what to do section describes tried and true categories of action. And this is where we cross over a little bit from a practitioner-focused document into sort of what a community or an organization or sector may be implementing on the ground. But we thought it was important to include here nonetheless. And so the fundamentals for the field document includes at least one, usually around 3 examples for each category of action you see here. And those examples aim to collectively span across a broad range of contexts and sectors, so that any adaptation professional might be able to find something of use for themselves in that collection. But we do especially welcome your recommendations for additional or alternative examples in any of these categories. And you may notice that the categories are listed vaguely, roughly in sort of chronological order for how a practitioner might recommend that adaptation action happen in a particular place or context. But it's really important to note that this list and the fundamentals for the field generally are really not at all meant to be an adaptation planning or implementation process of any kind. So we did not synthesize adaptation, planning, process, recommendation documents. That would have been a pretty different exercise, although there were adaptation planning processes included in many of the documents that we did synthesize. So, you know, that element is present here a little bit, but it's not the intention. The intention is not to synthesize any sort of adaptation planning process. But you will notice many similar ideas in this what to do section, as you might see in a planning process. And then, you know, finally, while the actions are, of course, the core of, you know, the work that happens on the ground, they're listed last because since this is a practitioner-focused document, the previous sections are laying the groundwork for what it looks like to effectively incite action in a particular context. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Beth.
Great. Thank you, Rachel, so much for taking us through the document and providing a little bit of kind of wayfinding signs for us as we explore this. And as we now think about what our next steps are, I've seen a few questions come in, so we want to spend as much time as we need to answer questions that folks on the call might have, reactions to this document, both from if you've looked at it ahead of time, if this is your first time hearing about it, reactions and comments. If you have some questions to pose on its origins, its purpose, and then, of course, suggestions for improvement. The goal for us in hosting these webinars and for putting out the draft version of this is to make sure that it's improved and to make sure that we are getting as much of the insight and information from all of you as we can as we prepare to set some fundamentals for the field going forward. I'm going to ask for Emily Lavka, who's on the line with us, to help moderate questions that we see coming in. And so I guess, Emily, if you can.
Sure. It looks like our first question is in the document. The document starts with where to start, and the presentation starts with outcomes. Is this a change in the document or just an emphasis in the presentation?
So I believe that the document that we sent out, at least what is in the handouts, also begins with the where to start. Let's see, I'm unsure. Definitely what we have in the handout starts with the introduction, and then it goes into the where to start section. So I think it follows the same pattern, but I might be missing something a little bit from that question. At least header-wise, I think they are consistent.
Yeah, Beth, I am noticing that I think 2 slides in our presentation, it looks like they got switched. So I think that may have, I think that was just a glitch in this.
Oh, got it. Sorry about that. Okay. Yep.
Yeah, sorry for any confusion that caused.
Okay.
Okay, great. So the next question is this document funded under a certain grant or foundation, or is this an independent ASAP initiative?
So this is an independent ASAP initiative. ASAP's core funding is from the MacArthur Foundation, and in that funding, our objectives are to strengthen the adaptation field, to build a network of practitioners that are able to share knowledge and share resources, and then to also advance this field of practice. So in a sense, this is definitely core in our ASAP program, and what our expectations and outcomes are to deliver to the MacArthur Foundation as our funder, but we certainly see this, it is not something that is funded independently, but it is really in the core programming of what we see that ASAP should be and is working to deliver.
Great, and it looks like John has a few questions, so I'm gonna just unmute you, John, if that's okay, and you can take it away. Okay, so while he is being unmuted, the next question is, this is a very comprehensive document, 13 pages, and it has given a lot of good information. Given that this is designed to be a standalone resource to guide practitioners, it seems that it could be really useful to distill this into a one-page list of general principles, such as holistic approach, equitable approach, science-based, etc., that others could distribute through their educational channels to local leaders, clients, etc. Such a list could be really helpful on the ground, while the more in-depth piece can be more for practitioners. Suggestion there.
That's really helpful. I like that idea a lot, and I think the ways that we can imagine presenting this in a way that is usable is as really it's as important as the information is useful in it. We see the next phase in the dissemination of this, as I'm calling it right now, it's living as a document, but the dissemination goal is to have a website that is set up that features these fundamentals and is something that is very interactive and also has these fundamentals, but then creates access to examples, to the exemplars that are out there of work that demonstrates these fundamentals in practice. And so I think having that one pager to kind of bring people into the overarching fundamentals and then having some way to go deeper, and then of course whenever this work gets done, it's one thing to have kind of a vision of what those fundamentals should look like, but being able to really help people tether to examples that might exist either in their kind of more sector-oriented persuasion or perhaps their regional orientation, I think is going to be really important. So it doesn't look like we've had luck getting John, giving him an audio pin. But hopefully we can keep working on that. And if that can come through, then John, I'd encourage you to throw your questions out there. And if other folks have questions, we can certainly work with you to get the audio up and running for yourselves as well. So let me talk a little bit now about where we're going in our next steps. And from this slide, you can see we have two requests for you. One is to fill out our review questionnaire. And the review questionnaire, we actually go to our next slide because we have more detailed next steps, both for you and for ASAP. So the first step is to fill out the review questionnaire. And what this is going to allow us to do is to really gain your feedback so that we can revise the fundamentals of the field and that we can start to build towards what does that digital home and web presentation for the fundamentals of the field look like. We also have another survey we would invite you to fill in, and this is where you can submit case studies. So if you are actively working, as many of you are out in the field, if you're somebody, especially someone who's maybe a service provider, if you have examples of work that you feel really embody these principles, we want to know that because we want to be able to point to your work as examples of work done well, work that we can celebrate and hold up as the best practices for the field. If you are interested in continuing to engage in this process, once we have that web presentation ready, we'll be holding focus groups to get feedback on the usability and the presentation of the fundamentals for the field. And you also could join us in being somebody who's a field leader. And this is a group of professionals that we'll be working with to really understand, once these fundamentals are established, how do we disseminate them and make them usable across other sectors? What we refer to as the climate impacted professions. So we have climate adaptation professionals, but we certainly understand that all professions are being impacted by climate change and need to be imbued with these fundamentals of practice. So if you can help us to be then extending these out to those pockets of different professions and sectors. We'd be very interested in engaging with you on that. So for you, that's your responsibilities. Think about this questionnaire, the case studies, and how you'd like to stay part of the process. And on the meantime, for us at ASAP, we will be working to revise and to finalize the fundamentals of the field, and then developing opportunities to bring them to life through training, education, and resource curation. One way that we're doing this is by curating existing case studies that illustrate the strategies. And then, as I described in the beginning of the webinar, developing a application for the fundamentals of the field training program. And that's a training program we see being developed over the next 18 months, and really thinking about how do we take these core tenets and using application examples, lift them up in beginning and be delivering training programs that can help people to advance their practice, and then also help all of us to continue transforming this field and to bring it forward and to really do more, faster, better, as we know is so necessary as we live in increasingly dynamic and often volatile times. It's very important to us that we are getting feedback from all adaptation aligned sectors. So we've reached out to engage folks from across really a broad swath of community, from water professionals to the legal community, architects. We're working with philanthropy, with private sector companies, with environmental justice organizations, and we hope that you will help us to extend that even further, and know that if you're working in a field or have colleagues who are in an aligned field, we would really like to see them engaged with this as well.
All right, Beth, it looks like John was able to unmute. John, would you like to ask your questions and your comments?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, wow. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure why I couldn't unmute before. Yeah, I just had some, I guess, kind of miscellaneous comments and questions, maybe mostly comments. So I went through the document pretty quickly, so I might have missed some things, so maybe some of these are not appropriate. But overall, I thought it was a really strong document and touching on, most of the key principles I think we need to follow. So things that came to mind are emphasizing the role of co-benefits, since a lot of resilience actions don't have immediate paybacks and you need something else to justify a lot of actions. So I think that's going to be important for people to keep in mind as they try to figure out how to move things forward. And then I think emphasizing that people need to plan for both extremes as well as new normals. I think in adaptation, we tend to focus a lot on the extremes, but our average conditions are going to shift as well, which has a lot of implications. Like the number, like here in New England, we're going to shift from more cooling to more cooling degree days than heating degree days, which has a lot of implications for building design. I think also thinking about the timing of impacts and when you need to have strategies in effect to address those impacts is important. I think planning for climate change kind of adds this additional element of time that we don't often have with other kinds of planning. And then I think it's really important to for people to understand the risks before they jump too far ahead in terms of taking action. I think I see a tendency to kind of jump ahead to actions and skip over understanding the risks. I think that can lead people down the wrong path. So I think those are the main points I wanted to make.
I really appreciate all of those points. I think that we are recording this so we can also be capturing these thoughts. I really appreciate your point about planning for the, quote unquote new normal, or really a dynamic normal. I think part of what ASAP tries to do is to make sure that the adaptation and climate change conversation is more than disaster response and more than just extremes, but thinking about the way that we holistically have to adapt to a changing climate, which is part of our day-to-day routines, not just when it is, most obvious and most what feels most maybe impactful because of essentially, kind of news coverage. I thought that your point about taking time to understand the risks is important too. I think that there's a deep impatience in the field and among people who are doing this work to get to action, but that recognition that a well-laid plan that I think has the components of adaptive management where you can pivot and be applying action in a way that is thoughtful and based on what is happening because of that dynamic future and because of that temporal challenge that's added through climate change is really, really important. So thank you, John. I really appreciate those. I really appreciate your thoughts and your comments in those.
Okay, thanks for listening.
Emily, are there other questions
Yes,
we should pick up?
Yep.
Great.
So one of the challenges of adaptation is the relative lack of matrix or quantitative measures of success. Is this addressed in the document?
That's a great question, and it's not. I think that this document remains quite process-oriented, and there's some thinking around that is where we are as a field is still difficult to set concrete metrics of what does success look like, but there is a fairly confident understanding of what a successful process should look like to bring you to a point that adaptation is being done in a way that is efficient and equitable and ethical wherever you are. I would encourage you and others who are interested in this question about metrics and evaluation to consider joining or tuning in to the ASAP affinity group on projects and evaluation. That group, that affinity group, has spent this year hearing from speakers from different adaptation sectors, areas of practice, building, health, adaptation mitigation nexus, and they're taking those presentations and building and now developing a white paper on evaluation and metrics for the field. And that's something that committee or affinity group is intending to produce by the end of this year, and I think should offer some really great insight that we can begin moving to. But at this point, this document really does have a process focus because we want to be respectful of where we are still and being able to say concretely that this is how we measure and evaluate success. Rachel, do you want to add anything into that? And if that's not entirely accurate, please correct me.
I think that that's mostly accurate in terms of the intentions of the document itself. There are mentions of the importance of evaluation and metrics in a couple of places in the document. I want to say, hold on one second. Yeah, in the what to do section, so it's actually a little bit counterintuitive, but in the observe and research action, it actually talks about, part of the observation and research is observing and documenting the outputs, outcomes, and impacts of, adaptation focused work. And so that is talked about there. And then there are a couple of other places where it's sort of mentioned as, a sub-bullet underneath the heading. But I think that you're right that this is more of a process-focused document at this time, and I think that there is ongoing synthesis and consideration within ASAP of needs in the field, which, you know, will further evolve sort of what we can offer to practitioners in the future.
How long does that review process, or excuse me, the review phase last, and when would you like to see the questionnaires done?
Well, with any questionnaire, sooner is better. We're very committed to having this be an inclusive process, and so we're hoping that by the end of this calendar year, we will have the fundamentals, the first attempt of ASAP putting forward the fundamentals of the field finalized and up and online. And so I think that puts us, I think this is an open period to the end of September was our planning. And then we'll be reviewing and seeing if we have adequate input and if we need to engage in another review process. So is that accurate, Rachel, on the time frame we're looking at? Is it the end of September that we wanted to have it open to? Yeah.
Yeah, we have September 28th is our closing date for the questionnaire. So I think unless we receive feedback to the contrary, you know, that we should keep the questionnaire open longer for any reason, it will close on September 28th.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think I've said this explicitly, and I apologize for that. We see this document as something that will also be, we said it's a living document, and by that we mean it'll be something that is both subject to and anticipated to be under review in the future. Something that is set out to set the standard for us, but understanding that this is a field which is rapidly changing, evolving, and improving. And so there will be regular intervals in the ASAP calendar and a biannual basis to come back and say, is this still a full and fair reflection of where we are and where do we need to get to and what do we need to add to it? So we definitely want initial comments back by the end of this month, and then there will continue to be opportunities to engage this and to improve this document as we see ourselves evolve and improve.
Great. We have just one last suggestion, so please send any questions you have to through that question feature. Suggestion here to look for case studies through the CAKE website and to categorize them from there.
Yeah, absolutely. We have both through formal and informal relationships, a great working relationship with CAKE and with its parent organization, EcoAdapt. And our goal in ASAP is not to be generating new case studies as a rule. There's a little exception to that when we do our Prize for Progress, and in that way we want to really feature the very best of what's happening. But our goal is always to work with our information service providers. That's CAKE, Georgetown Climate Center, Climate Access, the Forest Service. These are all groups that we have information sharing partnerships with, and to make sure that we're using their tremendous data organizing power and their position in the field as the case study collectors to be informing our work. So I like that suggestion. I think actually having somebody who could work between ASAP and CAKE and I think Georgetown Climate Center also to really seek out those exemplars of practice would be a great, I think it'd be a great thing for us to do, and it'd be a great actual concrete example of how we're collaborating, coordinating across our organizations.
And what's the best way to access the questionnaire?
There are a couple ways. I actually just dropped a link to the review questionnaire in the chat box, which everyone should have access to. If you don't readily see that, then we will be sending out a email immediately following this webinar, which will have a link to the review questionnaire. Also, if you're an ASAP member, then you have been getting links to that questionnaire in your past newsletters. So you could search back for those. You could also see it coming out in a newsletter that you'll be getting this week. So lots of ways. First stop is the chat box. Second stop will be watch your inbox. You'll be getting a link to it shortly, and then in your regular ASAP communication, you'll see it coming through. And that, I think, was a great question to take us out. If you have other questions that come up, comments that you want to share, please feel free to either use that webinar questionnaire format that we've talked about, or feel free to go ahead and reach out directly to me or to Rachel Jacobson. We both would be happy to talk with you about this document, its origins, its intended use, and ways that we can continue to improve it and to make it be really a reflection of both the state of our field and where we aspire to be with our field. So I want to thank everyone very much for joining me this afternoon or this morning, and I look forward to having feedback from you and getting to hear from all of you and gain your wonderful insights about the state of practice for the climate adaptation field. Thank you so much.